Welcome to the video for chapter 28 of the Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit, which is going to tell you about some irregular and unexpected perfect tense forms. In Sanskrit, there are irregular and unexpected forms in all three components of perfect verbs, in the reduplicative syllable, in the root, and in the endings. What we will do in this chapter is look at them one by one. So, first of all, reduplication. Whenever we have a root that begins with a consonant, then reduplication means taking the first consonant and the first vowel of this root in zero grade and combining them to form the reduplicative syllable. So, for example, of wish, to enter, we take the first consonant w and the first vowel I, and we combine them to we, which would be the reduplicative syllable, that we then combine with the root to give us the perfect stem. So, for example, in its weak form, we wish. However, whenever a root begins with a vowel, there is no initial first consonant that we can reduplicate, and we reduplicate only the initial vowel, and specifically we reduplicate this vowel in the zero grade. So, for example, of ish, to want, the reduplicative syllable would be I. Of ush, to burn, the reduplicative syllable would be u. Now, when we combine these reduplicative syllables with the verbal roots in order to form the perfect stem, in the weak forms we find that they contract I, ish, that is the reduplicative syllable plus the root in zero grade, I, ish, contracts to ish, which forms the perfect stem, u, ush, which is the weak stem of ush, combined to oosh. So, short vowel plus short vowel simply contracts to the long vowel. I-ish gives ish, u-ush gives oosh. When it comes to the strong stems, however, what we find is the reduplicative syllable, so I and u respectively, and then we find the verbal root in guna, which would be ish and osh, respectively. But in both of these forms, as you can see here, we don't just have the reduplicative syllable and the root, but in between reduplicative syllable and root, we have inserted, in the first case, a y, which is the semi-vowel counterpart of I. So instead of having I-esh, we have I-yesh, which has the result that both reduplicative syllable and root remain nicely recognizable. And in the case of the strong stem of ush, we have not u-osh, but we have u-wosh. So a w has been inserted, which is the semi-vowel counterpart of u. So i-yesh and u-wosh. Then, finally, we also have some verbs that begin with a consonant, but reduplicate as though they began with a vowel. So let's look at what's happening there. In verbs that begin with the semi-vowels y or w, and that are commonly listed under the guna of their roots, if you don't remember why that may happen, go back to chapter 7, which outlines all the reasons why a root may be cited in guna rather than in zero grade. So if you have a verb that fulfills both of these conditions, then it will reduplicate just like a vowel initial verb. Sounds rather abstract. Let's look at two examples. At the bottom of the table here, you can see the verbs yaj and wach. Both of these are cited in their guna, which you can see because they contain an a, which is the hallmark of a guna form. The reduplicative syllable of a perfect form, however, is based not on the guna of a verbal root, but on the zero grade. So what we need to do if we want to form the reduplicative syllable of these is to first of all put them into their zero grade. On the basis of yaj, we get ij, because if you take the a out of yaj, you're left with yij, which through internal sandhi appears as ij. And if you take wach and remove the guna a, then you're left with wuch, which through internal sandhi appears as uch. So we have the zero grades ij and uch. On the basis of these, we then form the reduplicative syllables, which are I and u respectively, and it's I and U that are then added in front of the verbal root to form the perfect stem. So, for example, in the middle column here, we have the first singular forms of these verbs. We have I, the reduplicative syllable, added to yaj, the root in guna, and then we have a, the ending for the first singular, giving us iyaja. And of wach, we have u, the reduplicative syllable, plus wach, which is the root in guna, plus a, again the ending for the first singular, so we have uwacha. In the weak stem, which we find in the dual and plural, and here the example that you can see is the third plural form, we have the reduplicative syllable I plus the stem in its, the root in its weak form, the root in 0 grade, so ij, and then we have the ending uch, which is what we find in the third person plural in the perfect, and so that gives us the form I, ij, uch, which is contracted to ijuch. Then similarly with wach, we find the reduplicative syllable u, and then the root in 0 grade, which is uch, and then our ending uch, and u, uch, uch is contracted to uchoch. So again, this happens because the reduplicative syllable is formed on the 0 grade of the root, but for a variety of reasons, there are some roots that are cited, that are listed or referred to, not in their 0 grade, but in their guna. And whenever we have a root like that, we need to first of all form its 0 grade, and only then can we know what its reduplicative syllable is going to be. Next, let's look at irregularities in how verbal roots are employed in perfect verb forms. Now, what we regularly find is the strong stem containing the verbal root in guna and the weak stem containing the root in 0 grade. However, there are 3 exceptions to this. First of all, roots that in guna contain a followed by just one consonant always have vritti in the third singular active forms, and sometimes have vritti also in the first singular active forms. So, for example, from pat, to fly or to fall, we get the first singular form either as pa pat a or as pa pat a. So pa is the reduplicative syllable, pat is the root either in guna or in vritti, and then a is the ending for the first singular, so papata or papata. The third singular, however, always appears as papata, so always has the root in vritti. Similarly, with ni, to lead, we get the first singular either as ninaya or as ninaya. So nai would be the guna of ni as it appears in front of a vowel, and here it appears in front of the ending a, so it has the form nai. And as an alternative to this guna nai that contains the vowel a plus just one consonant, we then have the form ninaya. In the third singular, we only ever get the form ninaya with the vritti of the root. Secondly, roots that have a as their guna vowel, so not roots like, for example, lik, which would have lek, so e in the guna, but roots that have a as their guna vowel, and that have an initial consonant that reduplicates as itself, that reduplicates identically, have their weak stems formed in the following way. The root does not reduplicate, but the guna a changes into e. So, for example, of pat, nam, and sad, 3 roots that have the guna vowel a, and that begin with a consonant that reduplicates as itself, p reduplicates as p, n as n, s as s, we have the third plural active perfect forms pet, uch, nem, uch, and sed, uch. So petuch, nemuch, and seduch. Very often, these same roots are those that also have vritti in their third person singular form. So we have pairs of forms such as petuch, but papata, nemuch, but nanama, and seduch, but sasada. Thirdly, verbal roots that end in a lose that a in the weak perfect stem. So, for example, from dha, to place, to put, we have a strong stem da dha, but a weak stem da dh. So, of this form da dh, we find, for example, a first plural da dh I ma. So we here have the I appearing in between a root that ends with a consonant and an ending that begins with a consonant. So we get da dhi ma. Or a third plural da plus dh plus uch, da duch. Similarly, of da, to give, we have the strong stem da da, but the weak stem da d. And of that we have the first plural dadima and the third plural daduch. Of sta, likewise, we have the strong stem ta sta, but the weak stem ta st, and so we get a first plural tastima and a third plural tastuch. Finally, there are some instances of verbal roots appearing completely regularly, following the normal rules, but nevertheless being difficult to recognize. And that's what we get with roots that end in a nasal. So let's look at those. When a root such as gam, to go, is employed in the perfect, we find it sometimes in guna. So for example, first singular jagamma. We sometimes find it in virti, third singular jagama. But sometimes we also find it in the zero grade. The zero grade of gam would be gm. So we remove the guna a and we're left with gm. So far we have mostly encountered this zero grade as ga. So for example, in the past participle we had gata, in the absolutive we had gatwa. That's the form that gm appears in whenever the m, the nasal, comes to stand between two consonants. So instead of gmta we had gata, instead of gmtwa we had gatwa. However, here we have a few forms where the gm remains as gm before endings that begin with a vowel. So, for example, in the first dual, we have ja, gm, plus the vowel I inserted that we get if a stem ends in a consonant and an ending begins with a consonant. So we have jagmiwa. In the first plural, we have jagmima. And in the third plural, we have jagmuch. So the zero grade of gam appears as gm, which is perfectly regular. However, we just haven't seen many instances of gm so far, so this might at first confuse us. And finally, irregularities concerning perfect endings. You will be delighted to hear that there is only one irregularity here, and that concerns once again roots that end in a. In those, the ending of both the first and the third singular perfect active is au. So of sta, to stand, we have a first and third singular active ta stau. Of da, to give, we have da dau. And of dha, to put, we have da dhau. Basically what's happening here is the regular ending would be short a, and if I were to add a to the strong stem, for example, tasta, then tasta would simply result in tasta, and that perhaps was not seen as recognizable enough, and so instead we find these very iconic, very noticeable forms ending in au, tastau, dadau, dadhau, and so on. From a practical point of view, this was everything that you need to know about perfect forms in Sanskrit. There is a small number of individual paradigms with various different irregularities that are not covered in this video, but if you would like to be thorough, you can just turn to the book for those. They are outlined in chapter 28 and also briefly mentioned in the reference grammar at the back of the book. Also, please note that class 10 verbs actually form their perfect in an entirely different way from what we've just encountered in this chapter. They form their perfect by using the so-called periphrastic perfect, which will not be introduced until chapter 34. That was it for this chapter. We hope that you found this video helpful, and if you have any comments or suggestions, we would love to hear from you. Please do write to us at rupal@cambridge-sanskrit.org. And now, for your own work on this material. Good luck and have fun!